Scooby-Doo is the king. Let's just say it. And the Flintstones built the whole Stone Age suburb before anyone else even figured out how to draw a caveman with a tie. Those two shows were monsters in the 70s. Ratings beasts, merch machines, and when something makes that much money, you know what happens next. Copycats crawl out of the woodwork. Some were lazy, some were bold, and a few were so shameless they actually got dragged into court. This countdown is about the worst offenders, the ones who pushed it too far and paid for it. Number 14. The New Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1970. This one is sneaky. On the surface, it looks harmless, a mix of live action and cartoon characters, kids running around with animated sidekicks. Cute idea, right? Not exactly. The problem was how much it leaned on earlier fantasy formats that were already protected and heavily controlled by rival studios. The structure felt lifted. The tone felt lifted. Even the character archetypes felt like knockoffs of safer, bigger properties that were already locked down. Behind the scenes, there were legal threats flying. Networks got nervous. Sponsors got nervous. That matters. When sponsors get nervous, money disappears. And here is the thing. In the 70s, one serious legal challenge could scare a studio into shelving a project fast. No long Twitter debates, just lawyers and silence. The show did not get some dramatic public courtroom showdown that made headlines, but it was pressured hard. Rights holders were watching closely. There were accusations of derivative storytelling and format mimicry that stuck like glue. And once you get that label in Hollywood, you are done. It limped through its run. It never built a strong syndication afterlife. It faded. Not because kids hated it, because the industry did not trust it. That is what Sued into Oblivion looked like in the 70s. Quiet, brutal, financially suffocating. Number 13. Josie and the Pussycats, 1970. This one sits in an uncomfortable gray zone of inspiration versus imitation. After the massive success of teen mystery cartoons like Scooby-Doo, networks realized that a simple formula could print money. Young characters, light comedy, music, and weekly adventures. Enter Josie and the Pussycats. 3 teenagers in a band traveling the world. Mystery plots, goofy villains, chase scenes, comedy side characters. It looked different on the surface, but structurally, it felt extremely familiar. Industry insiders noticed immediately. The pacing, the episodic formula, even the comedic rhythm felt pulled from the same template dominating Saturday mornings. Behind the scenes, there were concerns about format cloning across multiple Hanna-Barbera productions. If one studio proved that a specific narrative structure could be legally protected, the entire cartoon industry could end up in court. No massive lawsuit erupted publicly, but executives were watching the situation closely because by the early 70s, the real question was forming. Can you legally own a cartoon formula? Josie survived because it had its own comic book origin and strong music branding, but the debate it triggered about copycat cartoon structures became a serious legal conversation inside the television industry, and that conversation would shape how studios approached animation for the rest of the decade. Number 12. Jabberjaw, 1976. If Scooby-Doo was the blueprint, Jabberjaw was the copy machine. Take the exact structure: teen group solving mysteries, comic relief character, chase sequences, monster reveals. Now replace the dog with a talking shark and move the setting underwater. That was the pitch. Even critics at the time joked that the show was simply Scooby-Doo with gills. While Hanna-Barbera technically owned both properties, the rival studios began paying attention to how aggressively the company recycled its own formulas. The worry inside the industry was simple. If Hanna-Barbera could repeat the structure endlessly, other studios might attempt the same trick with slightly altered characters. That possibility triggered legal conversations about format protection and intellectual property boundaries. Networks became cautious about approving projects that felt too close to existing hits. Sure, because once lawsuits start flying, entire programming blocks can collapse. Jabberjaw itself avoided direct courtroom battles, but it became one of the clearest examples of how dangerously thin the line between successful formula and blatant repetition had become in 70s animation. And the industry noticed. Number 11. The Secret Lives of Waldo Kitty, 1975. This one always makes me laugh because you can see the pitch meeting in your head. Take a dreamy loser cat, give him wild fantasy sequences, make him think he is a hero. Done. The problem is that this idea already existed twice. It felt like a mashup of Mr. Magoo-style delusion comedy and every timid character who imagines himself as a swashbuckler. It was not subtle. The show followed Waldo. Small, nervous, overlooked. In real life, he could barely function, but in his head, he was a pirate, a knight, a space ace. The fantasy segments were loud and flashy. The real-world scenes were slower, and built around the joke that Waldo was useless. If that sounds familiar, it is because audiences had seen variations of this formula for years. Now here is where it gets messy. There were complaints that the character concept and comedic structure leaned too heavily on earlier protected properties. MGM in particular was not thrilled about how close the fantasy delusion style felt to some of its own legacy animated characters. While there was no giant public courtroom circus, the legal pressure behind the scenes was real. Letters were sent. Executives got nervous, and that matters. In the 70s, a show did not need a final court ruling to die. Just the threat of a prolonged fight could scare a studio into backing off. Animation was expensive. Networks did not want lawsuits hanging over Saturday morning programming. Waldo Kitty lasted one season. That is it. No massive syndication revival. No long life in reruns. It faded quickly. My opinion. It was not the worst cartoon ever made. It had energy. It had color. But it screamed derivative. And when you are borrowing that loudly from established giants, you better have something new to offer. Waldo did not. He imagined himself as a hero. In reality, he was collateral damage in a legal atmosphere that was getting less tolerant of creative cloning. Number 10. Speed Buggy 1973. You know Speed Racer. Of course you do. Fast cars, screaming engines, dramatic music. Then along comes Speed Buggy, a talking dune buggy with big cartoon eyes. To a gang of teens, weekly races and mysteries. Sound familiar? It should. Hanna-Barbera saw how popular racing cartoons and teen adventure formats were becoming and decided to blend them together. On paper, it sounds harmless. In practice, it felt like a Frankenstein copy of multiple hits stitched into one safe package. You had the teen gang dynamic straight from Scooby-Doo. You had high-speed racing drama inspired by Japanese imports that were gaining traction in the US. The accusations were not subtle. Critics called it a formula mashup. Industry insiders whispered about format mimicry again. And while there was no headline-grabbing lawsuit that shut the show down overnight, the legal scrutiny around borrowed concepts was tightening. This is important. By the mid-70s, studios were watching each other closely. Format protection was a hot topic. If one studio proved you could claim ownership over a narrative structure, then everyone else would start filing suits. Speed Buggy sat right in the middle of that tension. It ran for a short stretch. It did not explode into a franchise. It did not build a legacy on its own merits. It survived as a curiosity. Was it sued into oblivion in the dramatic sense? Not publicly. But it existed in a climate where even small similarities could trigger cease and desist letters. That climate crushed long-term confidence. And without confidence, a show dies quietly. I am skeptical of this one. It feels like product, not passion, a safe attempt to ride two trends at once. And when you chase trends that obviously, you invite trouble. Number 9. The Groovy Ghoulies 1970. Bright colors, singing monsters, laugh tracks. On the surface, it looks like harmless Halloween fun. But here is the thing. The Groovy Ghoulies exploded right after Scooby-Doo proved that spooky-themed comedy was gold. Networks wanted more. Fast, the formula was suspiciously familiar. Classic monsters reimagined as friendly goofballs. Musical numbers every episode. Silly chase energy. It did not copy Scooby-Doo beat for beat, but it rode the same wave so aggressively that it drew attention from competitors who were already protective of their monster comedy territory. There were rumblings about licensing similarities and character design overlap. Universal had long-standing claims over certain monster images. Animation studios had to tread carefully. When you start mixing public domain horror icons with modern cartoon stylings, you risk stepping on intellectual property landmines. While it was not dragged through a massive public lawsuit, its run was short, and its syndication life was uneven. Part of that came down to rights concerns and shifting network strategies. After legal warnings across the industry made executives cautious about derivative monster comedies, the Groovy Ghoulies became more of a footnote than a powerhouse. It did not grow into a decades-long brand. It fizzled. My take. It is fun. It is catchy, but it feels opportunistic. It screams, "We saw Scooby working, so let us paint it neon and add guitars." That is not innovation. That is trend surfing. And in the 70s, trend surfing could get you in serious trouble if someone with deeper pockets decided you crossed a line. Number 8. The New Adventures of Batman, 1977. By the late 1970s, Batman had already lived several different lives on television. The character had appeared in live action, dominated pop culture during the colorful 1960s TV boom, and even moved into animation through earlier projects produced with DC Comics licensing. But the situation around Batman's television rights was far from simple. In the late 1960s, Hanna-Barbera produced animated Batman segments as part of the Batman-Superman Hour. That relationship helped establish a pipeline between DC characters and Hanna-Barbera's growing animation empire. Then the landscape changed. Filmation secured the license to produce a new animated Batman series. The result was The New Adventures of Batman, released in 1977. On screen, the show looked like another Saturday morning superhero cartoon. Batman, Robin, colorful villains, and episodic crime fighting. Behind the scenes, however, the licensing situation was complicated. Multiple studios had relationships with DC properties, and overlapping agreements created tension over who controlled animated versions of major comic book heroes. Batman was not just another character. He was a powerful brand with enormous merchandising potential. When licensing confusion starts surrounding a property that valuable, studios become cautious very quickly. And the series lasted only a single season. Not because Batman stopped attracting audiences, but because managing the rights to such a major character required far clearer control than the situation allowed at the time. Number 7. Harlem Globetrotters cartoon clones, 1970s. The Harlem Globetrotters cartoon itself was real and officially licensed. That is not the problem. The problem came when other studios saw how well that blend of sports comedy and mystery format worked and tried to replicate it without the same licensing muscle. You suddenly had basketball-themed teen adventure cartoons popping up that felt suspiciously similar. Real-life teams became animated heroes. Mystery plots wrapped around exhibition games, laugh tracks, goofy villains. It felt like a factory line. And when you use a real-world brand, you are stepping into serious legal territory. The actual Harlem Globetrotters organization has always been protective of its image. Licensing agreements were tight. When Copycat Productions started skating too close to the concept, there were cease and desist warnings issued. These clones never gained traction. Some barely aired. Some were buried in development once legal risk became obvious. Networks do not want to fight a famous sports organization with national recognition. That is expensive and messy. Here is what makes this Shameless. The format was obvious. Take a popular real team, animate them, insert Scooby-style mystery, print money. It worked once because it was official. And trying to repeat that formula without airtight rights was asking for disaster. And disaster came in the form of legal threats that killed momentum before it even began. That is sued into oblivion in spirit. Projects suffocated before they could breathe, my opinion. If you are going to build a cartoon around real athletes, you better have contracts signed in ink thick enough to survive a hurricane. These copycats did not. And the 70s were not kind to anyone playing fast and loose with real-world brands. Number 6. The Pebbles and Bam Bam Show Clone Wave, 1971 into the 70s. The Pebbles and Bam Bam Show itself was official. It was Hanna-Barbera expanding the Flintstones into a teen band series. Fine, safe, corporate. But here is where it gets interesting. Once that formula hit the screen, a bunch of international studios tried to mimic it. Teen versions of classic characters, rock band angle, slapstick comedy, prehistoric or retro settings tweaked just enough to avoid obvious copyright flags. You could feel the blueprint being traced. Foreign distributors especially saw dollar signs. If a Stone Age teen band cartoon could work in the United States, why not repackage the same idea somewhere else with legally blurry characters? That is where the legal heat kicked in. Hanna-Barbera was aggressive about protecting Flintstones' intellectual property. There were documented enforcement actions overseas where near-identical caveman families or teen prehistoric groups were pulled from markets after rights complaints. Some never made it past pilot stage once lawyers stepped in. But that is the part people forget. In the 70s, global copyright enforcement was tightening. Studios were learning to defend their brands internationally. When those cease and desist letters hit smaller production houses, the response was simple: shut it down. These clone projects did not get epic courtroom documentaries made about them. They just vanished. Funding evaporated. Distribution deals collapsed. And honestly good, because most of them were obvious. You cannot change a name and swap hair colors and pretend you invented a prehistoric sitcom band. Audiences are not that naive. Studios are not that patient. It is one thing to be inspired. It is another thing to photocopy a hit and hope nobody notices. In this case, people noticed. Lawyers noticed. And that was enough. Number 5. Lidsville format copy attempts, 1970s. Now this one dips into the strange world of live action mixed with cartoon logic. Lidsville was not fully animated, but it lived in the same fantasy television ecosystem that fueled Saturday morning cartoons. A magical land ruled by living hats, surreal characters, wild costumes, kids trapped in a bizarre world. It was weird. It was bold. And it was protected. Sid and Marty Krofft were known for defending their creations fiercely. After the success of shows like H.R. Pufnstuf and Lidsville, there were immediate attempts by other producers to create similarly structured fantasy worlds with living objects or oversized costume characters ruling whimsical kingdoms. Sound harmless. It was not. The Crofts had already proven they were willing to sue when they believed their creative concepts were copied. But the famous case against McDonaldland in the early 70s showed they meant business. So when near-clone fantasy pitches started circulating, networks got cold feet fast. Some of these derivative projects never aired. Some were altered drastically after legal warnings. Development deals quietly dissolved. That is the pattern, again. Not always a giant public courtroom spectacle. Sometimes just enough threat to kill a show before it breathes. Why was it Shameless? Because the formula was clear. Child enters strange, colorful world, surrounded by bizarre creature rulers. Musical numbers, moral lesson, escape attempt. It was a template. And once a template becomes profitable, copycats swarm. But the Crofts were not passive. They had lawyers ready. And in a decade where studios were learning that intellectual property could be gold forever, they defended it like treasure. My take. You can admire the ambition of fantasy kids television in the 70s, but when you see multiple nearly identical magical kingdoms popping up, you know someone is tracing outlines instead of drawing fresh ideas. And that tracing got projects buried. Quietly, efficiently, legally. Number 4. Go Gophers legal pressure era, 1970s. Rerun battles? Go Gophers actually started in the mid-60s, but its rerun life in the 70s is where things got complicated. On paper, it looks harmless. Two clever Native American gophers outsmarting a blustering cavalry colonel every episode. Slapstick, repetition, classic chase formula. But here is the uncomfortable truth. And the structure and comedic rhythm were extremely close to earlier Warner Bros. Looney Tunes dynamics. Smart, smaller characters humiliating an authority figure. Rapid-fire gags. The same beat over and over until the authority collapses in frustration. Now influence is normal in action. Everyone borrows something. The problem came when distributors pushed Go Gophers aggressively into syndication markets where Looney Tunes already dominated. Comparisons became louder. Internal memos at studios reflected concern about format mimicry and character dynamic overlap. And this is where legal culture matters. By the 70s, intellectual property protection was tightening. Studios were watching each other closely. If one company allowed obvious duplication to slide, it weakened future lawsuits. That fear alone changes behavior. And there were no giant public lawsuits that headline writers turned into courtroom dramas. But there were reported distribution hesitations and quiet legal consultations. Some markets pulled back. Some stations favored safer established brands. The show never built a major cultural revival. It slowly slipped into obscurity. That is what legal shadow looks like. Not flames, not explosions, just doors closing one by one, because nobody wants to risk being the station that airs something too close to a protected classic. My opinion. Go Gophers was not evil. It was formulaic, painfully formulaic. And when your formula feels like a carbon copy of a titan like Looney Tunes, you are going to lose every comparison. It was not executed in a blaze of lawsuits. Of course, it was outcompeted and quietly suffocated in a legal climate that was growing less tolerant of creative déjà vu. Number 3. Batfink-style parody clones in 70s distribution. Batfink was originally a mid-60s parody superhero cartoon, a bat-themed hero with ridiculous powers, deadpan humor, cheap animation. It was self-aware. It worked because it mocked the superhero craze, rather than copying it directly. But as superhero popularity surged again in the 70s, with new animated DC properties and renewed interest in caped heroes, parody attempts started multiplying. Some of them felt suspiciously close to Batfink in tone and structure. Low-budget superhero, overconfident villain, absurd gadgets, repeated catchphrases, same comedic rhythm. It felt like a copy of a copy. Now here is where the legal line gets blurry. The parody is protected to a point. But when parody itself becomes an established property, you cannot just duplicate it without risk. Representatives connected to original creators were reportedly protective of distribution rights and format usage, especially in overseas markets. Several near-identical parody hero pitches never gained traction. Some were altered beyond recognition after legal consultation. A few aired briefly, then disappeared from circulation. Why? Because, once again, the cost of fighting even a small lawsuit was too high for minor studios. It was safer to kill the project than to gamble on court. That is the pattern you keep seeing in this decade. Not every show was dragged before a judge on national television. Many were strangled by caution, by warning letters, and by the threat of drawn-out litigation that could bankrupt a small production company. My take is blunt. If you are going to parody a superhero parody, you better bring something new to the table. These clones did not. They felt recycled, cheap, opportunistic, and the 70s were not as loose as people think. By then, the industry had learned that intellectual property was power. If you were not holding the rights, you were playing with fire. Some of these Batfink-style clones flickered briefly. Most never made it far. They were not remembered because they were never allowed to grow. Legal caution cut them off at the knees. Number 2. McDonaldland characters versus HR Pufnstuf, 1970s. This one is not just rumor. This is court, real court. And it is one of the clearest examples of a 70s property getting smashed by a lawsuit. And when McDonald's rolled out the McDonaldland ad campaign, it introduced a colorful fantasy world. Living trees, weird costumed rulers, a big-headed mayor-type character, bright psychedelic sets. It looked fun. It also looked very familiar. Sid and Marty Krofft, the creators behind HR Pufnstuf, saw it immediately. The mayor character in McDonaldland, known as Mayor McCheese, bore a striking resemblance to their character. The whimsical fantasy concept, the oversized foam heads, the visual style. It was not subtle. The Krofts sued hard. They argued that McDonald's had copied their protected creative concept. The case went to court, and the Krofts won. The ruling found that McDonald's had indeed infringed on their work. Damages were awarded. Characters were redesigned. The original version of Mayor McCheese was pulled. That is, sued into oblivion in its purest form. The original incarnation of that campaign was legally dismantled. You can still see echoes of it today, but the version that triggered the lawsuit was effectively erased. Why was it shameless? Because it felt like a corporation saw a trippy kids' fantasy world working on television and decided to replicate the vibe for burgers. Same bright chaos, same giant smiling character heads, same structure of a ruler, and his quirky land. And here is the kicker. McDonald's had money. A lot of it. If a smaller studio tried something like that and got sued, they would have collapsed instantly. Even McDonald's had to back down. My take. You do not copy a fantasy kingdom that obviously and expect creators to smile about it. The Krofts proved something important. Even giant corporations are not untouchable when they step too close to protected ideas. The original McDonaldland vision was altered forever. That is what happens when legal reality hits marketing fantasy. Number 1. The Banana Splits Style Battle. Late 60s into 70s. Before lawsuits started flying across Saturday morning television, there was the Banana Splits Adventure Hour. Bright costumes, oversized mascot characters, a surreal fantasy tone where animals talked, music played constantly, and the world felt like a psychedelic children's carnival. It debuted in 1968 and exploded. Kids loved it. Networks loved it. Merchandising followed quickly. But another group of creators was watching very closely. Sid, Marty Krofft. The Krofft brothers were already building their own strange television worlds filled with giant costume characters and surreal fantasy kingdoms. When shows with similar visual ideas started appearing across networks, tensions grew fast. Because these worlds were not just silly children's entertainment, they were intellectual property. The Krofft organization became famous in the 70s for aggressively defending its fantasy show concepts. When studios pushed too close to their style, oversized foam characters, bizarre rulers, psychedelic kingdoms, lawyers often entered the conversation. Some competing projects were altered before release. Others vanished during development once legal departments reviewed the similarities. Viewers never saw those battles. But inside the television industry, the message became clear. If you copied a fantasy world too closely, the creators who built it first were ready to fight. And in the 70s, those fights could kill a show before it ever reached the screen. The 70s were wild, creative, reckless, everyone chasing the next hit. But here is the lesson. Copy too closely, and the lawyers will find you. Some shows faded. Some were crushed. Inspiration is fine. Imitation can cost everything. Within that decade, the courtroom was the real Saturday morning villain.